This one is called The Haunted Car. Give you a little background story before we continue. Years ago, a friend of mine, his father, bought a car from an auction. Didn't know who owned it before, and the history of the car. It was a 1980 Camaro Z28. Lovely car, very quick. So he brought the car home, parked it on the driveway, and waited till the next morning so he can take it to the mechanic and get all the necessary paperwork, get things set up and ready to get the car on the road. And then that's when things got really creepy. So the next morning he brings the car to the mechanic. Mechanic looks it over, car's fine. Just a few little minor adjustments. The tires were good, all the lights were functioning. No fluids leaking. No rust anywhere underneath the vehicle. So things looked pretty good. So he paid for the services and got his paperwork and went down to the office to get his car registered and put his plates on, and he drove home. Well, later on that evening, decided to take the car for a drive. He left the family at home and got his favorite cassette tape, put it into the stereo, and started listening to his music. So off he went. Car handled really nice. So we decided to bring the car out a little further into the country area. A nice scenic drive. It was a quiet night, and then he started to feel a strange noise in the car, like a little rattle. So he pulled over and thought, well, maybe one of the plates on the car had come loose, or a decal or something. So he looked around, didn't see anything out of place, and got back in the car. It's not a problem. Maybe something in the trunk or somewhere on the floor of the car that's rattling around, no big deal. The mechanic looked it over, so everything was safe. I was driving along, and then suddenly he starts to get this cold feeling. Now, this is in the month of August. Pretty warm up here this time of the year. He's feeling a little cold, and he looks over to make sure the vent's not on too cold, and he adjusts the temperature, and everything's fine. But he has that cold sensation, so, well, whatever. So he turns the music up a little louder. He's driving along, and as he's driving, suddenly he feels like there's someone in the back seat. So he looks in the rear view, and of course there's nothing there, and takes a quick look behind him, says, okay, well, it's just his imagination. But he had that odd feeling in the car and just felt like someone was watching him. So anyway, he continues driving, he's got his music playing. And then at one point, he actually hears like someone in the back seat telling him to stop. And he heard that, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. So he rewinded the cassette and heard it again just to make sure it wasn't coming from there. And it was not coming from there. So he felt really odd, and he's like, well, you know what, maybe I should head back home. It's been a long day. So gets back in the car, and he's driving along. And as he's driving down the road, it starts to get a little misty. Seeing a lot of these horror movies and whatnot, you'll see the mist starting to come up off the road there, blowing in. Really creepy. But he makes it home, parks the car in the driveway, comes inside the house, doesn't say anything to anyone, and he tells the family that he likes the car, but it just feels kind of strange. So later that night, before he goes to bed, he looks out the window, and there's the car parked, and he's looking at it, and he's very proud of it. It's a real nice looking car, you should see it. I'll put a picture up on the screen. It was a metallic gold exterior paint color. It had big racing tires and Krager rims on them. Looked really nice. I've seen pictures. So he goes back to bed. And sometime during the night he wakes up, startled, and he's drawn towards the window, so he looks outside and doesn't see anything unusual. His car is in there, no one's walking around the property, it seems. But he feels uneasy, so he goes back to bed. Shortly after, he sees what looks like a flashing amber light reflect off the wall of his bedroom. So he gets up to go take a look, and the car's hazard lights are flashing on and off. He just stands there and looks at it, and he's paralyzed. What the hell is going on? So he puts his robe on, goes downstairs, grabs the keys, walks out the front door, and as he's walking towards the car, the lights shut off. He starts looking around. There's no one around. So he opens the door, looks inside. There's no one in the vehicle. So he sits in there, puts the key in the ignition, turns it, presses the button to get the hazard lights to flash on and off a few times, and everything seems fine. But he's just sitting there wondering, who activated these lights? Like, how do they don't come on like that? You need to activate them from your signal turner. So anyway, he gets inside. His wife says, well, what's going on? He said, well, just went outside to check on something. I thought I left something in the car. He didn't want to arouse any suspicion and scare his wife. So eventually he goes back to sleep. The next morning he gets up. Things are normal. He gets in the car. He's driving to work. Comes to a stop sign. As he's about to start driving forward, suddenly the radio comes on its own. It starts scanning channels back and forth, and he's freaking out. Keeps driving though, and he tries shutting the radio off, and the volume knob isn't turning things down. So he's thinking it's a malfunction perhaps on the stereo component. So he drives to work, parks his car, goes into his office, and he's telling his friends about this, and they're like, well, you just need to take the car back to the mechanic or have somebody at one of the stereo shops take a look at this. So it could be a problem with the radio. So he picks up the phone, calls a local radio shop in town, and makes an appointment to go in after work, and he's looking around, and he says, you've got a real nice stereo. I believe he said it was a Pioneer. Back in those days, in the 80s, early 80s, Pioneer was a very good brand. So he looked around and examined it and told him everything's fine. Your volume's working fine. Your cassette player's working fine. All the wiring is connected. You shouldn't have a problem with this. He goes, I don't know why that happened. He goes, that's very odd. So anyway, he goes home and doesn't say anything to anybody. And like I said, he didn't want to alarm anyone and freak anyone out. He did like the car a lot, though. It was a very nice looking car. So he's trying to grow attached to it, but at the same time, he's feeling kind of he's being pushed back. So he was feeling uneasy, and he called up a friend who was in the automotive industry, and he explained that he had purchased it from an auction through a broker, and that the car was acting really weird, and explained to him all the things that were happening. And his friend told him an interesting story. He said, a lot of times these cars are involved in crashes. In this case, not this particular car. I mean, everything body-wise was great. But sometimes people pass away in the cars. Sometimes they're part of illegal activity and other things. So you never really know 100% what happened in there, and it's usually not disclosed unless there's evidence. Now, when he got the car, there were no bloodstains, there were no evidence of any wrongdoing or illegal activity. So anyway, he left it as that and went to sleep that night. In the middle of the night, he got up to use the bathroom, and on his way back to the room, he goes to the window, looks back out at the car, and everything's calm. Everything's quiet. Goes back to bed. Next morning, he's getting ready for work. And as he goes out the door, he's walking towards the car on the driveway. And he notices something's out of place. He notices the rearview mirror is facing down. It's been bent down. And then he was thinking to himself, maybe he did it by mistake when he was in the car the last time or whatnot, but I don't remember doing that. So he gets in the car, starts the car up, adjusts the rearview mirror, and as he's adjusting the rearview mirror, he says he caught a glimpse of a face right behind him. So he froze in there. Took a quick second look again and didn't see anything. Thought, this is really weird. He says, maybe I shouldn't have gotten this car. So anyway, he gets out of the car, closes the door. He tells his wife that he's going to have a friend pick him up, and she's getting suspicious. Why aren't you taking your car to work? And he says he just has a funny feeling about that car. So for today, the friend can drive him. So he called his friend up. Friend came pick him up. They went to work. So the car sat in the driveway all day. So when he got home in the evening, checked the car over, walked around, looked inside, everything was cool. Went inside, had dinner with his family. That night, he was getting ready for bed. And he looked out the window, and you'll never believe what he saw. He saw a man sitting in the driver's seat staring at him. He freaked, ran down, grabbed his keys, grabbed a baseball bat, went out the door, and when he got to the car, there's nobody there. He swore he saw a man sitting in the driver's seat, looking straight at him. The doors were locked. There was no attempt to break into his car. He started thinking he was losing his mind. So he went inside, and his wife was all worried, and they were going to call the police. And he said, well, no one's broken into the car. He says, but I actually saw a man sitting there. He looked right at me. So his wife said, maybe you've been working too hard and maybe you need to get some rest. He says, you've been very stressed lately. It's like, no, I'm telling you, this is what I saw. So he's starting to think, maybe I should just sell this car. So the next morning, he gets in the car, goes to work, starts making a few phone calls. And he found someone that wanted to buy the car from him. So that afternoon when he got home from work, shortly after, the first potential buyer showed up at his house. He's showing him around the vehicle and started the vehicle up. They both took it for a quick test drive. Showed him all the paperwork from the recent certification, the mechanical inspection. Both men then agreed on a price and decided that tomorrow morning they would exchange money and keys. So that night he went back to bed and feeling really bad because he really liked that car a lot. But because of all the strange events that have been happening the last little while, he felt he had to give it away, part with it. So nothing unusual happened that night. And of course, the next day, the man came by with a check, and he gave it to him. And when he handed him the check, the car started up on its own. The man realized something was really off here. He's freaked out. No one had started the car up that morning. So if any mechanics out there want to explain this, I would love to hear your explanation. It had been sitting overnight on the driveway and started up on its own. Of course, that killed the deal. The man took his check back. The car never did sell. Months later, one day coming back home from work, he's driving along, and the same road he was on was a road where the streetcar traveled, parallel to the road. Up ahead, the light had turned red and there was a car already stopped at the light, so he started to press the brakes slightly. The car started acting odd and started shifting side to side. Felt like he was losing control and he wasn't driving very fast. So he pumped the brakes again and suddenly the car moved to the left onto the path of the oncoming streetcar. He started to panic and pumping the brakes and trying to gain control of the vehicle. He suddenly realized that he was heading towards the streetcar. And at the last second, he heard a voice behind him tell him to move to the right. So he did, moved it really hard to the right, turned back, and in doing so, he was already at the red light, and he clipped the car in front of him. The whole car was damaged from the front end all the way back to the back end. Thankfully, nobody was hurt, but the car was destroyed on one side. The car was sent to the body shop for an estimate. And when the estimate came back, he decided he didn't want to keep the car and he made a deal with the mechanic and said, "Look, if you'd like, you can keep this car. I don't want it." And the mechanic said, "Seriously, this is a really nice car." He says, "Once I fix it up, it's going to look brand new again." He says, "I don't want the car." So the mechanic kept the car. And a few years later, my friend's dad saw that same Camaro on the road being driven by the mechanic. So he waved him over and he pulled over the car and he said, "So how you been enjoying the car?" He says, "Oh, the car's great." He says, "I haven't had any issues or anything." He said, it's very strong. It's a fast car." He says, "I love it." They continue talking for a little bit, and then he notices there's a face pressed up against the window. The driver looks at him and said, "What do you see?" He said, "There's someone in your back seat with their face pressed up against the window. I've seen that face before." And the driver said, "Don't worry about it. He's my buddy." He said he came with the car.